I spent 34 years as a civil engineer, and the one thing that job teaches you, the one thing that gets into your bones and stays there, is that you don't build anything worth keeping without a solid foundation. Bridges, overpasses, drainage systems. You test the load before you trust the structure. You document everything. My son never understood that about me. His wife understood it even less. My name is Harold Weston. I'm 68 years old. I live in a 4-bedroom house on just over an acre outside of Knoxville, Tennessee. The same house I bought with my late wife, Diane, back in 1991. We raised our son here. We planted the oak tree in the backyard the spring after he was born. Diane died 7 years ago, breast cancer, and I've been here alone since then. I keep the gutters clean. I mow my own lawn. I drive myself to my doctor's appointments, and last spring I drove myself to Asheville and back for a weekend hiking trip without telling a single soul, because I'm 68, not 88, and I don't owe anyone a travel itinerary. My son is 39. He works in logistics management. He and his wife have been married 6 years, and for most of those 6 years, things were fine between us. Strained in the way things sometimes are when two families try to merge into one extended unit, but fine. We had Christmas at my house. I drove up to their place in Louisville for birthdays and the occasional Sunday dinner. I babysat their daughter when she was small. I helped them replace their water heater the winter after they bought their townhouse, because my son still doesn't know the difference between a compression fitting and a flare fitting, and that is not a criticism. It's just a fact, like the fact that I cannot name a single song from the last decade. The trouble started 18 months before Thanksgiving, not dramatically, not all at once. It crept in the way water damage does, invisible behind the drywall until the wall starts to bow. His wife's parents had been living in Chattanooga. Her father, a man I'll call my son's father-in-law because that's the only relationship that matters here, had retired early on account of some back problems, and her mother had never worked outside the home. They weren't destitute, but they weren't comfortable either. When the lease on their apartment came up, they started talking about downsizing. When downsizing didn't solve the problem, they started talking about family. I found out about all of this gradually. A comment here, a passing remark there. My son mentioned that his in-laws were going through a transition. His wife mentioned, at Easter, that her parents were looking at options. I nodded. I said I hoped everything worked out for them. I meant it sincerely. Their financial situation had nothing to do with me. Then came the Sunday call in October. My son called on a Sunday afternoon, which was unusual. He typically texted. He asked how I was doing, which he always does, but this time there was something deliberate about it, the way a person asks a question when they already know what they want the answer to be. Fine, I told him, working in the garden, getting the beds ready for winter. Dad, he said, I want to talk to you about something, and I need you to hear me out before you respond. I put down my trowel. He explained that his in-laws were in a difficult position, that the rental market in Chattanooga had gotten steep, that they were looking at a significant shortfall between their fixed income and their monthly expenses. He explained that he and his wife had talked it over extensively, and they had come to what he called a logical conclusion. The logical conclusion was that his wife's parents should move into my house. Into my house. The house I own. The house where I live. The house with the oak tree I planted with Diane. I waited until he finished. I had promised to hear him out, and I kept that promise. He made his case for about 4 minutes. He mentioned the spare bedrooms. He mentioned that it would be good for me to have company. He mentioned, and I remember this clearly because it made my jaw tighten, that he and his wife worried about me being out there alone. When he was done, I said, Son, I appreciate you telling me. The answer is no. There was a pause. Dad, I don't think you've really thought this through. I have a graduate degree in structural engineering, I said. I am capable of thinking things through. He didn't laugh. I hadn't expected him to. The weeks after that call had a particular texture to them. Careful, watchful. My son and his wife were polite when we spoke, the way people are polite when they're assembling something behind your back and don't want you to notice the noise. My daughter-in-law called me twice in November, which she had never done before. Just to check in, she said. Just to see how I was holding up. I told her I was holding up fine. I told her the garden looked great going into winter. She laughed, a little too brightly, and said that was wonderful. In early November, I got an alert from my bank. Someone had attempted to log into my investment account from a device I didn't recognize. The attempt failed because I used two-factor authentication. a habit I picked up years ago from a colleague who'd been the victim of identity theft. I changed my passwords that same afternoon. I didn't say anything to my son. I noted it in a document I keep on my personal laptop. I also called my attorney. His name is Gordon Albrecht. He's been my lawyer for 22 years. We went to school together, not the same program, but we overlapped at the University of Tennessee and ended up at the same poker game one Friday night in 1987 and have been friends ever since. I told Gordon what my son had proposed. I told him about the login attempt. I told him I had a feeling things were going to get worse before the subject was dropped. Gordon said, "You want to get ahead of this." I said I did. We spent 2 hours at his office going over my estate documents, my financial accounts, my property deed, my medical power of attorney. We updated several things that hadn't been touched since Diane passed. We put into writing, clearly and legally, exactly what I wanted done with my assets, and exactly who had the authority to make decisions on my behalf if I became incapacitated, and that person was not my son, and it was not my daughter-in-law. It was Gordon himself and my younger brother, who lives in Chattanooga, ironically enough, and who has the good sense to stay out of other people's business. When I left Gordon's office that afternoon, I felt the way I used to feel after a final inspection on a big project. Like the structure was sound, like I'd done the work. Thanksgiving was at my house. It had always been at my house. 23 years of Thanksgivings in that kitchen, that dining room, with the good china that Diane picked out the year we got married. My son and his wife arrived the Wednesday before with my granddaughter, who is 7 and the best person in my immediate family, and no offense to anyone else. My daughter-in-law's parents drove up from Chattanooga on Thursday morning. I want to be clear about something. I had no particular animosity toward my in-laws. I barely knew them. We had shared maybe a dozen meals over the course of 6 years. Her father was a quiet man who watched a lot of football. Her mother was pleasant, but had a habit of walking through other people's houses with a particular look on her face, assessing, cataloging. I had noticed that look before. I noticed it again on Thanksgiving when she came into my kitchen and ran her hand along the countertop and said, "This is a lovely space." I thanked her. "You must rattle around in here," she said. "I manage," I said. Dinner was fine. My granddaughter sat next to me and told me at length about her second-grade class hamster, whose name was Biscotti, and who had recently learned to use a ball. I could have listened to her talk about that hamster for the rest of my natural life. The adults made conversation. The turkey was good. I had made Diane's cornbread stuffing from her handwritten recipe card, which I keep in a plastic sleeve in the kitchen drawer, and it came out exactly right. The trouble started after dinner, when my granddaughter had gone to watch a movie in the living room, and the 5 of us were sitting around the table with what was left of the wine. My son cleared his throat. "Dad," he said, "we wanted to revisit the conversation we had in October." I looked at him. I looked at his wife. I looked at her parents. I understood, in that moment, that the dinner had been something of a staging area. "There's nothing to revisit," I said. My answer hasn't changed. My daughter-in-law leaned forward. She was trying to look patient, the way a person looks patient when they are the opposite of patient. "Dad." She calls me Dad. She has since the wedding, which I had been fine with up until approximately this moment. "We're not trying to upset you. We just think you're not seeing the full picture." "What picture am I not seeing?" "Mom and Dad need somewhere to go. You have the space. It makes sense for everyone." "It doesn't make sense for me," I said. "This is my home, and we're not saying it isn't." She reached across the table and put her hand on my arm. "But you're 68. You live alone. What happens if something goes wrong? What if you fall? What if you get sick? You need people around you." "I need to live in my own home in my own way," I said. "That's what I need." Her father shifted in his seat. Her mother looked at the tablecloth. My son said, very quietly, "Dad, you're being selfish." That landed. I won't pretend it didn't. Not because it wounded me, but because I could see how thoroughly he believed it. He was not saying it to hurt me. He was saying it because somewhere along the line he had convinced himself that it was true, that my refusal to hand over my life and my home to other people's needs was a moral failing on my part, rather than a basic assertion of my own autonomy. I took a breath. "I'm going to ask you not to say that to me again," I said. "Dad, I'm going to ask you not to say that to me again." My daughter-in-law's face changed. The patience drained out of it, and what replaced it was something harder, something I hadn't seen before. She picked up her wine glass. I thought she was going to take a drink. She threw it at me, Not at the table, not at the wall, at me. The glass hit me just below the shoulder, and it didn't shatter. It was one of the heavy-stemmed ones, not the good crystal, but the wine soaked through my shirt immediately, cold and dark red, and I felt the sharp edge catch the side of my forearm when I raised it instinctively. Not a deep cut, but a cut. The room went completely quiet. My granddaughter was in the other room. I could hear the television. I stood up, slowly, the way I used to stand up after a long day on a job site, when everything in your body is tired but your mind is still working, still running the numbers. I picked up my cloth napkin from the table and pressed it against my forearm. I looked at my daughter-in-law. She had both hands flat on the table, and she was breathing hard, and she looked, if I'm being honest, more frightened than I was. I looked at my son. He hadn't moved. I said very calmly, "You should probably get her home." Then I walked to the kitchen, picked up my phone from the counter, and sent Gordon a text. The text said, "It happened. I'm fine. Going to the ER to have my arm looked at. Phase 1. Then I went back to the living room and told my granddaughter that Grandpa had to step out for a little while, but that there were leftover rolls in the kitchen, and she could have as many as she wanted. She asked if I was okay. I told her I was fine. I told her to watch her movie. I drove myself to the ER. 12 minutes. No traffic on Thanksgiving evening. The cut needed 4 stitches. The attending physician asked me what happened, and I told her the truth, that a glass had been thrown at me and the edge caught my arm. She asked me if I wanted to speak to someone. I said I had already been in contact with my attorney. She gave me a form to fill out. I filled it out. While I was in the waiting room before the stitches, I also called the non-emergency police line and reported the incident. The officer I spoke to was polite and professional. He said someone would contact me in the next 24 to 48 hours. I said that was fine. I had documentation ready. What I had, specifically, the security camera footage from the dining room. I had put cameras in the common areas of my house 14 months earlier, not because I was expecting anything dramatic, but because I am an engineer, and I believe in documentation the way some people believe in prayer. The cameras were there when I had work done on the house, and I had simply never taken them down. They recorded continuously to a cloud backup that I could access from my phone. I had footage of my daughter-in-law throwing a wine glass at a 68-year-old man at his own Thanksgiving table. I had footage of my son sitting there and not moving. I had the bank records of the unauthorized login attempt 6 weeks prior. I had the notes I had been keeping since the October phone call, dated and time-stamped, detailing every conversation in which pressure had been applied regarding my living situation. What I did not have, and did not need, was anyone's permission to protect myself. The police came by the Friday after Thanksgiving. 2 officers, both professional, both thorough. I showed them the footage. I showed them the medical records from the ER. I showed them the stitches, which were healing but still visible. One of the officers wrote everything down. They told me the footage was significant. They told me that what I was describing, the thrown glass, the physical contact, the sustained pressure regarding my living situation and finances, constituted a pattern they would need to document carefully. My daughter-in-law was interviewed. I don't know exactly what she said. I know that her account of the incident differed materially from the footage, which is the thing about security cameras. They are indifferent to what you wish had happened. My son called me 4 times between Thursday night and Sunday morning. I didn't answer. Gordon told me not to, and Gordon was right. On Sunday evening, I sent my son a text that said, "I love you. I am not angry at you. But I need you to understand that what happened in my home on Thursday was not acceptable and will have consequences. Gordon will be in touch." He didn't respond for 2 days. When he finally called, his voice was different, quieter, the way a voice gets when the scaffolding has come down and you're looking at the structure underneath for the first time. "Dad," he said, "I'm sorry." I let him finish. He spoke for a long time. He talked about the pressure he'd been under, about feeling caught between my needs and his wife's family's needs, about how he had convinced himself that he was doing the right thing by pushing me. He cried at one point, just briefly, the way men of his generation cry, surprised by it, a little ashamed, trying to stop. I remembered when he was 7 and fell off his bike in the driveway and tried very hard not to cry and then couldn't hold it anymore. I said, "I know you love me, son. I know that. But loving someone doesn't mean you get to decide how they live." He was quiet. "This is my house," I said. "I built a life here. I worked for 40 years so that I could have a home that's mine, and a retirement that's mine, and a life in my later years that is mine to live as I choose. That is not selfishness. That is the whole point. More quiet. And if anyone attempts to access my financial accounts again without my explicit permission, Gordon will know before the attempt is complete. Dad, I don't know anything about that. I'm telling you anyway, I said. So that it's been said. There was a longer silence. Then he said, almost like a kid asking a question he wasn't sure he was allowed to ask, "Are you going to press charges?" "I'm going to let Gordon advise me on what's appropriate," I said. "And I'm going to tell you that what happens next depends a great deal on whether the people involved understand what they did and take responsibility for it." I don't know if that was the right thing to say. I don't know if there was a right thing to say. I had a cut on my forearm with 4 stitches in it from my daughter-in-law's wine glass. I had documented evidence of attempted financial manipulation. I had a son who had sat at my table and watched his wife throw something at me and hadn't moved. There are some things that don't go back to the way they were. You patch them, you reinforce them, you work with what you have. But the original structure has changed. Here is what I can tell you from the other side of it. I am still in my house. The oak tree in the backyard is bare now, November being November, but it will leaf out again in April the same way it does every year. My granddaughter sends me drawings in the mail, and 2 weeks ago she sent me one of Biscotti the hamster in his ball, and I have it on the refrigerator. My daughter-in-law's parents found an apartment in a senior community about 20 minutes from my son's house in Louisville. It took them 4 months, and it was a harder road than it would have been if anyone had simply been honest about what they could and couldn't afford and what was and wasn't reasonable to ask of other people. But they got there. Gordon is still advising me. There were no criminal charges ultimately, but there is a formal written acknowledgement from my daughter-in-law that the incident occurred and that her behavior was inappropriate. Gordon told me that document might matter someday if certain patterns continued. I told him I hoped it wouldn't come to that. I still take the hiking trips. I still drive myself. I still get up at 6 in the morning and drink my coffee on the back porch with the radio on low, and I still do the crossword puzzle in ink because I have been doing it in ink since I was 42, and I see no reason to stop now. What I want to say to anyone who's watching this and recognizing any piece of it, whether it's the pressure, or the "we're worried about you," or the quiet background noise of someone trying to reorganize your life without your consent, is this: you are allowed to say no. You are allowed to say no to things that seem reasonable on the surface. You are allowed to say no to people you love, in a voice that is calm and clear and does not apologize. You have spent your life building something. That something belongs to you. Document everything. Know your attorney's number. Put it in your phone under the contacts you can reach in 30 seconds. And do not let anyone call you selfish for protecting what is yours. Because here is the thing about that word. The people who use it against you are almost always using it to mean, "You're not giving me what I want." That's not selfishness. That's a boundary. There's a difference, and the difference matters. And knowing that difference might be the most important structure you ever build.